the business cycle, you should hope that you get some of these questions, right? Because this is very much a layup. I think it's important to memorize that graph showing, and it's obviously pretty simple, right? So showing how the cycle moves. Understand that there are two general phases, so expansion and contraction. Now, don't use the term recession. It's a contraction. Not every contraction is a recession per se. And then each phase has two terminal points. We have the peak for the expansion phase, and we have the trough for the contraction phase. And so I think it's important to understand what is going on as the economy moves through these phases. So in the US and in economies similar to the US, it's going to take on average about 7 years to complete this cycle. Now, obviously, it's not a hard and fast rule, right? So some economic cycles or business cycles are more protracted, like the one we're currently in, which you could argue is we've been in a much more than a 7-year expansion here, and sometimes they're more compressed. So, but in general, we would expect about 7 years to complete the cycle. And we're going to start at the peak. So at the peak, you would be expecting the economy to have very high gross domestic product, which is what we talked about last week, and very low unemployment. And then as it starts moving past peak, you would expect that gross domestic product would begin to reduce and unemployment would begin to increase as measured by long-term unemployment. So you get down to the trough, which is going to have very low GDP, if not negative GDP, and very high unemployment. And then we start moving back into a growth phase where we start going into the expansion phase where we have increasing GDP and decreasing unemployment. So I think what would be good from a test perspective is if given a scenario of what is happening in the economic cycle. So let's say they say, well, the US has experienced 3 or 4 quarters of negative GDP growth and unemployment is very high. What's likely to be the next phase of economic activity? Well, I think you would be able to identify, given those parameters, that we are in a trough. And so very likely that the next step into the economic cycle would be to have an expansion. We're going to get into, in a little while, what the Federal Reserve does with monetary policy and what Congress does with fiscal policy to try to deal with they try to manipulate the outcomes and try to force certain things to happen within the economy to move on to the next stage. So we'll talk about what those are. You also want to understand that a recession, by definition, is 2 consecutive quarters. So 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth.